Once again, it's good to be with you. This our third installment in the five-part series on covenantal salvation history, or the family of God, down through the ages. We are, as you recall, studying the way that God fathers his family through Old Testament history, leading up to and preparing the way for the Catholic family that is, in a sense, the masterpiece of our Heavenly Father through his eternal firstborn Son. These themes of Father-Son are going to be very important as we look upon the Mosaic covenant this evening. Before I do that, though, I want to just briefly review that timeline. I want to kind of etch that into your mind, the back of your eyelids, so that even when you close your eyes at night, you can almost envision a timeline. Remember, there are 5 key covenants we're focusing upon. First of all is the covenant with Adam, which was a marital covenant. And so through these covenants, we've said that God is establishing his family in just a little marriage. The second covenant was with Noah. At that point, God's church family is a household. And then generations later, the third covenant is with Abraham. And at that point, God is fathering a family through this new covenant that is a tribal family church. And then this fourth covenant that we're going to focus upon right now, this evening, is the covenant that receives far more treatment than the first 3 put together. That is the covenant that God establishes with Moses, transforming the 12 tribes of Israel, so they're no longer one tribe or a tribal family church. Now they're going to be a nation of 12 tribes and a national family of God. God's national covenant family church, if you want to add to the sentence. And we're going to move on beyond this tomorrow night to look at the Davidic covenant, the covenant that God establishes with King David and his son Solomon, so that Israel as a national family is elevated above the other nation families in the world and is given military power, and in Solomon's case, divine wisdom, so that he might know how to subjugate these nations and reduce them to a colonial dependence as vassal states, so they depend upon God's wisdom and truth and have to come up to Jerusalem to worship the Father in heaven, and so prepare to be received back into God's family. Because you see, ever since the Tower of Babel, the family of men is one big unhappy family torn apart by sin and pride, injustice and violence. And God, instead of destroying it over and over again, promises with the flood never to do it again. And so he begins this reconquest with Abraham, tracing that all the way back to Shem, Noah's righteous firstborn. And remember, in Genesis, Shem is perhaps the only firstborn son who isn't an abominable failure. He's the only one who doesn't succumb to the pride of place that the firstborn might have. He doesn't abuse his brothers. He actually uses his superior position to serve his father and his family. So he is elevated and blessed in a unique way. But the rest of Genesis reads like a travesty, a record of continued failure for firstborn sons. And you'll discover that this spells ruin for God's family, unless God does something drastic. Now, at the end of this timeline, of course, we have Jesus Christ coming for the purpose of internationalizing or Catholicizing that family, so that now the whole human family, through his own body and blood, might come back to God the Father and sit at table with him and sup with him as his children at the Eucharist, having been baptized and received back home. But now that I've distinguished between these 5 Old Testament covenants and the New Testament covenant, the new covenant that Christ establishes, I don't want to tax your brain. I don't want to burden it too much, but I want to make one more threefold distinction that is classical among biblical scholars. That is, you can divide biblical history into 3 parts accurately as well. The first part you might want to call the natural stage. That is, where God's family religion is built upon nature, where the father is the priest over the family church, where he's the king, and where he's the prophet teacher. The father is priest, prophet, and king, all wrapped up in one. And his firstborn is crowned prince and heir apparent and the successor to the priesthood, like Shem is to Noah. That's the nature of the family relations. It's a natural family religion. And the family is at once both church and state, because the father is at once both priest and king in his tribal dominion, as it were. But now, with the Mosaic covenant, we enter into a decidedly new phase. Sometimes it's called Levitical, sometimes it's called the legal phase of salvation history, because now all of a sudden we're going to see, with the Mosaic covenant, there at Mount Sinai, with the worship of the golden calf, God is going to strip the priesthood away from fathers and sons and give it to the tribe of Levi for a long time, for over 1,000 years, in fact. And so for over 1,000 years, from Moses until the coming of Christ, we live in the legal stage of history, wherein all of the Levitical ceremonies and all of the animal sacrifices that are performed by the Levite priests are going to be the substantial liturgy of God's family. We've moved beyond the natural family, and now we have a kind of bureaucratic interim arrangement with the tribe of Levi serving as priests. And we're going to look into the reasons why that changed and the significance of that for us as Christians, because I think we're going to see it's important. But the third and final phase we could call the age of grace, or the evangelical stage. It is not dependent upon Levitical ceremonies like animal sacrifice. We're allowed to eat pork. We're allowed to have pepperoni pizza. We're allowed to have sausage and bacon. They couldn't. They had all kinds of dietary regulations and animal sacrifices and calendar festivals that required slaying literally hundreds of thousands of oxen, cattle, sheep, and goats. It was a bloody sacrificial mess during the Levitical phase, but now we enter into a clean phase where the sacraments of the new covenant become the means by which God binds himself to his family. The sacraments become the bonding agents for God's family in the new covenant. So as we focus upon the Mosaic covenant this evening, realize that we're looking at something old, the Old Testament, but something new in contrast to where we've come from. The patriarchal religion was a religion of nature. The Mosaic religion is a religion of law and ceremony and the Levitical bureaucracy. And that doesn't change until God, through his own firstborn son Jesus, in a sense, restores the order of nature, and in the new covenant, he's also going to perfect and elevate it in a supernatural way. Because you see, human weakness is our lot ever since Adam's fall. And so fathers are not just selfless lovers. Exhibit A. Fathers are selfish, immature people. And so when they raise up the firstborn son, who's supposed to be a role model to the kids, I know my older brother was the pace setter in our family. I never listened to my parents' laws. I just watched to see what my brother could get away with. And I took my cue from him. That's why I got into so much trouble. The police will attest to our names being in many of their books when we were teenage delinquents. But the fathers aren't perfect, and sometimes the firstborn sons are even worse. Human nature is weak and fallen. So what becomes of the father-son relation? Does God do away with it? Well, for a time it seems so. In the Levitical age of Mosaic ceremonies, until the eternal lover of all fathers, the Father in heaven, sends the eternal firstborn son to reinstitute this order and to reinstitute it at an infinitely greater level. So we have a heavenly family. And the Mosaic covenant is the bridge. It makes it complicated, but it also makes it crucial. Now, we focus upon the biblical material in our remaining time. Now, if you think that we can be proud of ourselves for last night covering over 10 chapters, actually we covered practically 22 chapters in one night, in 1 hour. I know, a little more than 1 hour. Sorry about that. I want to tell you that we have Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy to get through, and that includes over 100 chapters. We're not going to be doing things quite the same way, all right? And even now, we have to go back into Genesis just to catch us up, because a great span of time elapses between Abraham and Moses. What happens in the interim? Can I summarize rapidly the closing chapters of Genesis? I'll try. You know that Abraham had a son named Isaac, the one he sacrificed and got back from God. Isaac married Rebekah, and Rebekah gave him twin sons. The oldest of the two twin brothers was named Esau. The younger of the twin brothers was named Jacob. He's the key figure. Again, God will pass over the firstborn son to go to the righteous, secondborn. Because we'll see once again, the firstborn's pride leads him to fall. So we see how God, from the very moment they're conceived, tells this couple, Isaac and Rebekah, the elder shall serve the younger. So the parents should know that God has already earmarked the second of the two to be his crown prince and heir apparent, his hand-picked man. But as Isaac gets older, we discover that he starts playing favorites. And because his older son Esau is able to cook up these great meals that he's hunted down, Isaac begins to want to bless Esau, whereas God initially wanted him to bless Jacob. So as he's getting old and decrepit and somewhat blind, steps in Rebekah, the wily wife, who through her wiles and cleverness brings about God's initial way. He has Jacob dress up like Esau in this big fur coat that smells like Esau. He comes in for the blessing. Remember how we've stressed the blessing and its importance? Whoever gets the blessing gets it all. He is the one who stands in line to possess all the authority of the Father. Whoever has the blessing will stand in relation to his brothers like a father. So Rebekah connives with Jacob to come before Isaac disguised as Esau to get the blessing. Isaac falls for it. He gives the blessing to his second twin son, the younger of the two, and then Jacob leaves. Esau comes in a few hours later with this beautiful banquet meal that he just hunted down. Isaac begins to tremble when he realizes he's been tricked. And he tells Esau, now, if a blessing was just a light thing, you know, like you sneeze and somebody says, God bless you, Isaac could have said, I'll bless you anyway, Esau, but he says, no, the blessing has gone forth and I cannot retrieve it. Your younger brother got it. He tricked you. And the word Jacob literally means he who supplants or undermines. So he really Jacobed his brother. Esau is infuriated. He has a vendetta. He's going to go kill him. He's going to kill his brother, so his brother has to run and hide. And he actually works out a deal with his father Isaac to flee the country and to go back to another area up north, Haran, where some relatives live. So we have Jacob fleeing his older twin brother Esau, fleeing for his life, because Esau wanted that blessing. You might think, what treachery, but if you read carefully in Genesis, you'll discover from earlier chapters that Esau never really wanted in the first place. Early in their lives, Esau actually sold it legally to his younger twin brother for a big pot of porridge, some pottage that he wanted more than his own birthright. So in a sense, he despised his birthright, as the New Testament says of him. So anyway, Jacob leaves to go up north to Haran. He meets this man named Uncle Laban. And here is where Jacob gets a taste of his own medicine. Here is where Jacob gets Jacobed by Uncle Laban. Because there he meets Laban's daughter Rachel, which means little ewe lamb in Hebrew. And he just falls head over heels in love with her. I want to marry Rachel. And he says, okay, work for me for 7 years, and that'll be your dowry. 7 years? Fine. And it says it went by lickety-split, because he wanted her so bad. The night of the wedding, Uncle Laban pulls a switcheroo. It's so dark in the honeymoon tent, he takes Rachel's older sister, Leah, who can hardly see. She's partially blind. Leah means cow. So he takes her older sister, the blind cow, and slips her into the honeymoon tent, and they consummate the marital relation. In the morning, Jacob wakes up, says, wait, I've been Jacobed. Goes out, and in ancient customs, once you have consummated such a relationship sexually, there ain't no going back. So he says, I wanted Rachel. Well, it's our custom to always marry the oldest daughter. Well, why didn't you tell me that in the first place, you know? Because I wanted to give you a taste of your own medicine, in effect. At least God did through Laban. So he works for 7 more years and becomes a bigamist in the process, because at the end of those 14 years, he marries Rachel. That's the good news. The bad news is that Rachel, this beautiful ewe lamb's second wife, is barren, whereas the blind cow Leah gives birth to 4 sons in no time at all. Some pretty famous guys, too. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. 4 patriarchs who are going to become the fathers of 4 of the most prominent tribes of Israel. Rachel is intensely jealous. So jealous, in fact, that she pulls a Sarah. She tells her concubine, she tells her maidservant, Bilhah, why don't you sleep, my maidservant, why don't you go in and sleep with my husband and have children for me? They don't learn their lessons, do they? Just like we don't learn our lessons either. So Bilhah, the concubine, goes in and raises up some sons, but that's not the same as having your own. So Rachel's distraught and sorrowful. And then after 20 long years, Jacob finally finds a way to take Leah and Rachel and leave Uncle Laban and to go back home where Esau is waiting. So Jacob gets all this booty and treasure and has it go in advance to reach brother Esau to appease this man's temper. And it works. When they finally meet, they hug, they embrace, they kiss. And Jacob submits to Esau's power. And there's somewhat of a reconciliation. Meanwhile, finally, Rachel gives birth to a man named Joseph, who from now on becomes the key character in Genesis. Because by the time Joseph reaches his 17th birthday, there ain't no question who the old man favors. Now, Leah's kids are much older than 17. This Johnny-come-lately named Joseph, this little this half-pint upstart is laying claim to the birthright. Because what could Joseph claim? Well, I am the firstborn son of the beloved wife, the one he initially intended to marry. And so Jacob gives him this coat, which provokes all kinds of resentment and envy in the half-brothers. Why? Because it's like the coat of arms in a sense. It's like the mantle of the father's authority, and they all recognize it. So when he's 17, he's out there, he's herding some flocks, and his half-brothers come out to meet him, and they decide to kill him. And they throw him down a pit. Then they decide otherwise. Reuben says, we can't do it. So they pull him out of the pit, and they see some traders, and they sell him into slavery. They take his coat, pour goat's blood on it, take it back to Father Jacob. He sees it, thinks it's his son's blood, weeps and wails and mourns Joseph's death. And Joseph is sold down into slavery down in Egypt. Incidentally, the 2 groups of traders in the caravan who bought Joseph from his half-brothers are Ishmaelites. They're cousins from Ishmael, Abraham's other son. They're also Midianites. After Sarah had died, Abraham had remarried some foreign woman, shame on him, Keturah. He had a boy. The Midianites and the Ishmaelites team up, and they resent Abraham's family through Isaac and Jacob. They look for opportunities like this to take Joseph and sell him into slavery, because they're half Egyptians anyway, through Hagar. Anyway, I know this is good. This is like a soap opera, isn't it? You know, you're like, oh wow, you know, I need some kind of chart for all of this, you know. I tell you, they could make an incredible movie from all this stuff. I don't know why Hollywood hasn't waken up. You know, it's probably too religious, I don't know. But if you read it, it certainly doesn't strike you as being overly spiritual. Anyway, Joseph winds up in Egypt as a slave for Potiphar, who's one of the most powerful men in Egypt. And whatever Joseph touches turns into gold. And Potiphar's impressed, and even more is Potiphar's wife impressed. So impressed that she repeatedly tries to seduce Joseph. And he won't have anything to do with it. She gets so adamant at one point that she begins to strip and go after him. He starts running. She grabs his coat and yells, rape, rape. Whereupon he is arrested and thrown into prison for raping practically this priest prime minister's wife. He's in prison. He's forgotten. He's forlorn. But there he meets this baker and this butler, some other people, and he shows his wisdom in interpreting dreams. And the baker and all these people down in the prison are impressed, so that when they're released, they carry out the knowledge that there's an incredible Hebrew who can interpret dreams like nobody else locked down there in the dungeon. So what? Well, one day Pharaoh has a nightmare, And he calls everybody to interpret, and nobody can. He gets perturbed. I want somebody to interpret my dream. They remember Joseph. They bring him out of prison. Joseph says, you had a dream, and he begins to interpret the dream, and he says, what the dream means is that the next 7 years are going to be 7 consecutive bumper crops, 7 beautiful harvests followed by 7 very lean years of famine. Not bad. Pharaoh makes Joseph prime minister. Wow. From prison to prime minister in a day. Not bad for a power play. Now, everything comes true just like the dream had said in his interpretation. 7 years, incredible harvests. So Joseph begins to store up all of the grain in silos, knowing of the famine that's coming. 7 years of famine hit. And the whole Middle East is stricken and starved. So badly that word gets out there's only one place in the Middle East where you can find some food, down in Egypt. So guess who ends up going down into Egypt to get some food? His 10 half-brothers. They think he's, forgotten, perhaps dead, whatever, a slave. They don't recognize him when they come before the prime minister to beg for bread, but he recognizes them. And he pulls all kinds of shenanigans with them. I mean, he just turns them every which way but loose. And then finally, in one of the most poignant scenes in all literature, Joseph breaks down and reveals himself to his brothers. And they can't believe their eyes and ears. They go back to Father Jacob and say, Joseph is alive, and he's the prime minister under Pharaoh, and he owns and controls all Egypt, because the lazy Pharaoh didn't want to be operative. He didn't want to be in control of the daily affairs. He turned it all over to Joseph. So when Joseph's family, including his father Jacob, who had his name changed to Israel by this time, by God himself, Israel brings his whole family down into Egypt, and the Pharaoh says to Joseph, put him in the best real estate. So he puts him in Goshen. That's important. He puts them in Goshen, and they settle there, and they own Goshen, which was like the Garden of Eden. It was like paradise. They got the prime real estate, the best property there. Meanwhile, all the Egyptian farmers are also starving, so they have to come to Joseph for food. And he just works out a little deal. You give me all of your land, and in exchange, I'll give you bread. So at the end of 7 years of famine, guess who winds up owning Egypt? Joseph, Jacob's family, sitting fat and pretty up in Goshen with all the bread they want, while the Egyptians are all now serfs under this foreigner prime minister named Joseph. That is the key to it all. Genesis ends with this story and ends with Jacob Israel blessing his 12 sons. It's a beautiful story. But then all of a sudden, we come to Exodus. And here we read that Joseph and his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. And then a new king who knew not Joseph came to power in Egypt, which basically means a palace coup succeeded in overthrowing one pharaoh in his dynasty, replacing it with a new dynasty. Doesn't mean he never heard of Joseph. In the Bible, to know someone, well, like Adam knew Eve and she has a child. It means intimate family relations, covenant relations, the covenant term, yada in Hebrew. This new Pharaoh did not know Joseph. In other words, we've got no intimate covenant family relations with you Jews, with you Israelites, sitting fat and pretty in our best land, Goshen, owning us like serfs. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly. What does he decide? He resolves to kill all of the Hebrew male children at birth. Now you might think, what a maniac. What a slaughtering pig. But what is the political savvy in that decision? What is he actually intending to do by killing off all of the... Is he just anti-Jewish? Well, then he'd kill the women as well, right? When they're born. Why is he killing off the Hebrew male children at birth and not the females? Because when the females grow up, who are they going to marry? Egyptians. Then to whom will the title, the land title, pass over to? Egypt. So with a few political moves, we're going to retrieve all of this real estate and put them back where they belong. Not so dumb. I mean, pretty wicked and pretty diabolical, but there was a method to his madness. So we read how the Hebrew midwives wouldn't cooperate, and they kept bringing forth these children, and some were slaughtered, but one in particular was successfully hidden before being killed. A guy named Moses, which literally means to be brought up out of the water. So Moses is born, and for survival's sake, he's put in a little ark and sent down the Nile River, where he gets kind of stuck in the bulrushes. Pharaoh's daughter comes down to bathe and swim, sees a little baby, hears it crying, picks it up, says, "Oh, what a lovely little Hebrew child," adopts it as her own son. Moses is raised in the royal court of Pharaoh as one of the king's sons by adoption, or nephews, or whatever you have it, because we're not clear on the details here. Anyway, he grows up, getting the best clothes, the best education, the best food, the best everything. And then one day, knowing that he's Hebrew, he's walking out there, and he sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating some Hebrew slaves, whereupon he kills the Egyptian taskmaster in a fit of fury. Kind of goes overboard. In other words, he's decided to kind of cast his lot with those that he shares flesh and blood with, his Hebrew compatriots. He's jumping ship, in other words. The next day he goes back to the Hebrews, probably plotting to kind of lead them out or back to strength and power. What do they say? "Hey, here's the Pharaoh's own boy coming over on our side." No, they say, "Oh, you're going to kill us too?" And pretty soon he realizes that the word is out, and the Israelites aren't sympathetic to him. They think he's some fair-haired, spoiled brat. They want to have no part in him. They're not going to follow him. They reject him. The Egyptians are now hunting him down, so he has to flee out into the desert. He's fleeing for his life, and he just barely gets away, and then all of a sudden he meets a man named Jethro and his beautiful daughter Zipporah, a Midianite, incidentally, so a relative of Abraham's. There he ends up marrying Zipporah and raising children, Gershom, a few others, out there in the desert with the Midianite nomads. So from Hebrew to Egyptian to Midianite, the poor guy's like a man without a country. What happens? God hears the groaning of the Israelite slaves and remembers his covenant. So one day when Moses was tending the flock of Jethro's father-in-law, the priest of Midian, so again, he moved into a very prominent family, he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. And there God appears to him in a burning bush. Says, "Moses, Moses, here am I. Don't come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham." Now, if he'd stopped there, Moses would not have known for sure what God he was dealing with. Because after all, if he was just the God of Abraham, the Midianites could claim him, because the Midianites come from Abraham. The Ishmaelites could claim him too, because they come from Abraham. And even the Egyptians could lay some claim, because after all, Abram's wife, the first one to bear him a child, was Hagar the Egyptian. But he goes on to say, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If he just said Abraham and Isaac, the Edomites, who were descending from Esau, could have said, "He's our God," because they all wanted a kind of exclusive monopoly on him. But I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He narrows down the family line so you can see from Shem to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all the way down to Jacob, Israel, and the 12 tribes that are enslaved in Egypt. I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt, and I'm going to do something about it. I want to bring them out. And so he gives to Moses a sign, saying, the sign that I will do this is that I will bring them to worship me on this mountain. Then Moses asks his name. I am who I am. I am is my name. Go tell them that I am has sent you. Go tell these people and go tell Pharaoh that the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifice to the Lord our God. But then he says, I know Pharaoh's not going to let you go, so I'm going to have to send all kinds of plagues his way. But the initial request is what? Let my people go? That's what we usually think. But no. what his initial request is 3-day vacation. To leave Egypt, to go to this mountain, to worship and offer sacrifices, and then to go back into Egyptian slavery. We often forget that God's initial request through Moses was not total liberation and freedom, leave the country, but just simply a 3-day religious festival. If Pharaoh had cooperated, we're going to see why in just a minute. And then he gives him some signs. He says, take that staff that you have, throw it on the ground. And it becomes a snake, and he ran from it. Then he said, reach out your hand and take it by the tail, and then when he did, it becomes a staff again. That sign will convince them perhaps. And then he says, put your hand in your cloak. And when he pulled it out, it was white, leprous, advanced leprosy. So now put it back. And he brought it out, and it was like baby flesh. What is he doing? He's taking various signs. That staff is it's a symbol of Moses' authority. When Moses throws it down, it's a serpent, a symbol of evil. Moses has dominion over evil. He grabs it by the tail, and it's his rod of authority again. Israel now in Egypt is sinful, and sin is constantly being compared to leprosy. In Egypt, leprosy. When they come out, they'll be my children. These signs should convince them, but of course we'll discover soon enough that they don't. After all of this, Moses is scared. Oh Lord, I've never been eloquent. Neither in the past. He goes on to say, I stutter. Oh, why send me? He's really fearful. And it tells us, Moses said, oh Lord, please send someone else to do this. And then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, what about your brother Aaron the Levite? He's already on his way to meet you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth, and I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth and as if you were God to him. So Aaron now enters into the picture as a kind of intermediary. Now, take your Bibles out at this point and turn with me to my favorite passage in Exodus. Exodus chapter 4. Moses goes back to his father-in-law and says, you're going to have to let me go, so I go back to Egypt and tell them to let my people go. He consents, and he starts back with his wife and his sons on a donkey to Egypt. He took the staff of God in his hand. Look at verse 22. This is kind of a Western Union summary of the message. Then say to Pharaoh, this is what the Lord says. Israel is my firstborn son. And I told you, let my son go, so he may worship me. But you refuse to let him go, so I will slay your firstborn son. What is God saying through Moses? Quite simple. God is saying, Pharaoh, Israel is my firstborn son. Does that mean that Israel is God's only child? No. It means that the other nations are like God's younger children, Israel's younger siblings. But that God intends for Israel to be a kind of pace setter and role model, a firstborn, a model for righteousness and wisdom so the nations might learn how to walk in the ways of God, much like Shem, much like Shem's descendant Abraham. And so now Jacob, Israel's national family. Israel is my firstborn son. Egypt, you're potentially my children, but only if you let my firstborn son go to serve me, so that you'll learn how to serve me by watching him. That's the plan. Israel's going to be like a priest. You know how fathers raised up their sons to be priests in the family back then? So God the Father is raising up Israel to be a priest to all the other nations, if only the nations will cooperate. But they won't. And here comes that favorite verse of mine. Verse 24, it's just kind of ho-hum, reading along in the narrative. At a lodging place along the way, the Lord met Moses and tried to kill him. But Zipporah took a flint knife, cut off her son's foreskin, and touched Moses' feet with it. Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me, she said. So the Lord let him alone. You ever picture God as an assassin? Read that again. At a lodging place along the way, the Lord met Moses and tried to kill him. Well, which way is it, Lord? Do you want to use Moses to liberate your people, or do you want to exterminate Moses along the way before he gets back? What's going on? Moses is a covenant breaker. Gershom, his firstborn, is uncircumcised. Genesis 17 says, if any man refuses to circumcise his son in 8 days, I shall cut him off like so much foreskin. Moses has broken the covenant. Now why? The Midianites practiced circumcision. Historians will show us that. But Midian, just like Ishmael and the Ishmaelites, circumcised like the Arab Muslims do to this day. When are Arab Muslims circumcised? It's a male puberty rite at 13 years to make him a man, not at 8 days. Maybe Moses was thinking, well, you know, when in Rome, do as the Romans, when in Midian, do as the Midianites. I don't want to offend Jethro, my father-in-law. Well, you're offending God the Father, who meets him there and tries to kill him, so to speak. In other words, he's showing Moses, I mean business when I'm talking about covenant breaking. When you break the covenant, you rupture my family. And I don't take to that in any soft terms. So what does Zipporah do? Immediately circumcises Gershom and touches the blood to his legs or to his feet, and God relents. Now, there's probably a lot more there, and I know several journal articles written by top scholars trying to figure all of it out, but it shows us an incredible and fascinating episode that almost cost Moses his life, to show how serious God is about obeying covenant statutes. He goes back, finds his way to Egypt, finds the Pharaoh, and orders the Pharaoh to let him go. Let us go and sacrifice to our God. No, he decides to make the work harder. Says, you're lazy. So he offers these promises of deliverance to the elders, and even the Israelite elders don't want to cooperate with Moses. He explains, look, I just spoke to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he wants to let you go, but they're not interested in following him. After the genealogy of Moses and Aaron in Exodus 6, we turn to Exodus 7, and the action begins to speed up. Now all of a sudden we see Moses resorting to these various signs, and then we see the first plague, the plague of blood, the first of 10 plagues. And I got to tell you, God is not just flexing his muscles saying, here, you know, watch this, the Nile River, I'll turn it to blood. The Nile River was worshipped as a god by the Egyptians. The god Hopi was identified with the Nile. When you turn the river Nile to blood, for all practical purpose, you've just slain one of their gods. So likewise, in chapter 8, when God sends this plague of frogs and they all start dying and stinking up the place, that is a judgment on the goddess Hecht, which was always worshipped in the form of, you got it, frogs. And then gnats come. But each time, the people in Goshen are completely protected from all of the plagues. Verse 25 of Exodus 8 is key. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, go sacrifice to your God here in the land. But Moses said, that wouldn't be right. The sacrifices we offer to the Lord our God would be detestable to the Egyptians. And if we offer sacrifices that are detestable in their eyes, they will stone us. We must take a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God as he commands us. And he says, okay, I'll let you offer sacrifice to the Lord your God in the desert, but you must not go very far. Now pray for me. Only then he turns around and changes his mind. But again, we're only dealing with a preliminary request, a 3-day religious holiday. But why can't they sacrifice in Egypt? This is one of those things that I hear people missing over and over again. I mean, my professors who taught the Exodus missed this. I didn't find it until I was reading St. Thomas's Summa. This was well known to the early fathers of the church, but for some reason it's often neglected. Why did God require Israel to come out of Egypt to worship and sacrifice at Horeb, out of the boundaries, and then offer to return as slaves back to Egypt? What was it God wanted them to sacrifice? Pharaoh says, well, if you have to sacrifice to your God, do it in our land. No, because we have to sacrifice the abominations of the Egyptians, is another translation. That which is detestable in the eyes of the Egyptians. In other words, they have to sacrifice 3 animals, cattle, goats, and sheep, all 3 of which were revered and worshipped as divinities in the Egyptian religion. It's like going into India and killing a cow. You don't do that kind of stuff safely. We're going to have to leave Egypt. Well, why? I mean, is God really saying that those things are just intrinsically divine, demons or something? No. But Ezekiel 20 tells us that Israel had been in Egypt so long that it had already begun to absorb this idolatrous cult, this religion, a religion of nature, of fertility, of power and wealth. The demons, through these gods, promised to give all kinds of earthly treasures and influence in exchange for your eternity. The demons have always been offering this kind of exchange, like Satan. If you will worship me and worship power, worship all the things of earthly goods and earthly wealth and so on, I'll give that to you if in exchange you'll give me your soul and your eternity. Egyptian religion was built upon that. And the powerful and the fruitful animals were symbols of this kind of veneration. God says, kill them. Why? Because you're addicted. Ezekiel 20, we don't have time to look at it too much. Let's turn to it quickly. It'd be hopeless if we don't look at it briefly. Ezekiel 20 makes this so patently clear in retrospect. Verse 7, Ezekiel is told by God, I said to them, each of you get rid of the vile images you have set your eyes on, and no longer defile yourselves with the idols of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. But they rebelled against me and wouldn't listen to me. They did not get rid of the vile images they had set their eyes on, nor did they forsake the idols of Egypt. And all of this, if you read on, is before the Exodus. It's sort of like, you know, if you have a married couple and the husband is an alcoholic, and over again he gets vile and violent and abusive because he's drinking. And over again the next morning he apologizes profusely and swears never to do it again. And after 20 times, it just won't cut it anymore. So you say, okay, take that bottle of Jack Daniels under the sink, and I want you to do a little ceremonial smashing. But I could sell it to my friend. No, forget it. I'm leaving with the kids. Smart woman. He takes that bottle and smashes it, thus renouncing this addiction, this idolatry. That's what God was calling Israel to do. You have become addicted and enslaved to the idols of Egyptians' power cult, their religion of personal power and wealth and pleasure. It combined political power, economic wealth, and sexual pleasure. A lot like a certain American culture I happen to live in. Political power, economic wealth, and sexual pleasure are addictive in every age. Only back then they had religious sanction, and they had a liturgical form that consisted of worshiping sheep and goats and cattle as the symbols of this fertility and this power and so on. Kill them. The Egyptians won't let us in. Get out of Egypt for 3 days. And go back into Egypt and you can resume your status as slaves, because God knew that if you can free yourself spiritually from this idolatry, then it doesn't matter what you are politically. The political liberation only comes as a result of Pharaoh's hardness after 10 plagues. But if it cooperated at the beginning, God is saying it's enough for you to liberate your soul from bondage to idols and addictions to earthly goods. You'll be free no matter what your earthly circumstances are. But of course it's not enough. And so Pharaoh responds with hardening of his own heart. And it gets worse. In Exodus 9, the plague on livestock, and that is a great judgment on Apis, one of the supreme deities, as well as there was a Hathab, I believe it was, a goddess who was associated with livestock as well. The bull god Apis, the cow god Hathor, and the ram god Khnum were all judged and condemned and symbolically slaughtered in these plagues. Systematically, God even told Moses to tell Pharaoh, these plagues are going to ruin the gods of Egypt, to show Israel that I am the God of the universe, and to break them of their addiction to power, and to wealth, and to pleasure. The plague of darkness is a judgment on Re, the Egyptian sun god. Chapter 10. But then ultimately, the 10th plague is the most terrible of all. The plague on the firstborn, which results in the Passover. Why? Because Pharaoh was considered to be divine, and his firstborn was divinized in a ceremony. And so symbolically, in a sense, all fathers and their firstborn sons were called to share in a quasi-divine power and wealth. The firstborn represented, in a sense, the political gods of Egypt, when you destroyed the firstborns of a culture that depends upon family relations and tribal structures, that's like having an election year where everybody in Congress runs and all the incumbents lose, and all of the newly elected representatives gather in a place and they're all systematically killed. You've got a power vacuum. By slaying all of Egyptian firstborns, you've got an immense power vacuum in which Israel can finally escape, in which Israel will no longer be seduced or even attracted to this kind of culture and this way of life. The plague on the firstborn. God says, the angel of death will pass through the land and slay every firstborn. But then Moses gives instructions for the Passover. Take a lamb without any broken bones. Take the lamb, slay him, and sprinkle his blood on the doorposts, and that night eat the lamb. Go to bed, you'll wake up, your firstborn will be alive. You don't, your firstborn son will be dead, and all your firstborn of the flocks will be dead as well. Incredible. So Moses tells them what to do. All the elders systematically prepare the people, and they do it, and the destroyer, the angel of death, passes over the land, and there's great wailing and mourning throughout all of Egypt, and finally Pharaoh says, get out! And then, of course, the Egyptians are kind of pressured into giving up all of the gold and silver in exchange for the years of slave labor, and the Israelites plunder the Egyptians of their wealth and then skedaddle under Moses' leadership in the Exodus. But then all of a sudden, in a weird and demonic sort of way, the Pharaoh has a change of mind and gets the few soldiers he's got left in the chariots and so on and charges. Can you imagine what a maniac this man must have been? I mean, his livestock, his flocks, and all the crops have been completely wiped out. This country is in ruins, and he won't let him go. He's been too humiliated. His pride won't let him. And this, of course, is where the great crossing of the Red Sea occurs. In Exodus 13 and 14, we read about that. I'm not going to spend so much time there because I think we all know the story with some familiarity. The Holy Spirit leads them as a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of smoke by day, and they have to learn to put their faith in God and Moses, his servant, 14:31. And then Miriam sings the song in Exodus 15. It's beautiful. In Exodus 16, out in the wilderness, God feeds them after they've learned to trust him by seeing all of the Egyptian soldiers and chariots wiped out. And then, besides the food, the miracle bread that God gives them, in Exodus 17, the water from the rock after they're grumbling and complaining. And then they have so many complaints that finally Moses has to appoint 70 elders in Exodus 18. And then in Exodus 19, we have a very crucial section where God declares to Israel her own identity. Verse 5, now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests. So Moses goes back and he summons the elders and says, we've got a few instructions. The Lord's coming down, and here are the instructions in verse 10. Consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and be ready on the third day. Because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Put limits for the people, etc., etc. And he gives all of these things. And then over in verse 15, then he prepare yourselves for the third day. Abstain from sexual relations. Interesting. Next verse. On the morning of the third day there was thunder and lightning, just as he said. Thick cloud over the mountain, very loud trumpet blast, and everyone in the camp trembled. We discovered that all the people are begging and pleading Moses, you alone go up there. Why are they so scared? All they had to do was basically shower and wait 3 days and abstain from sexual relations. Why are they so scared? You know why they're so scared. Because they're humans. They didn't do it. Abstain from sex for 3 days and it becomes the forbidden fruit, the most attractive of all. Those 3 days become the most impossible of all. These guys failed. God says you will be a kingdom of priests. Kingly priests. You won't rule through political power like the Egyptians. You will rule through wisdom and righteousness and holiness. You will compel the nations to come back to me if you'll trust me and meet me and come to me face to face and hear me speak my law of love. And they don't obey, they tremble, they fall back and say, Moses, you alone go up. God says, I knew it. he speaks to Moses the 10 Commandments. I'd love to spend another hour on them, but I'll be merciful to you. Now, here is something that you might not have known. Let's jump ahead to Exodus 32. Moses is up there. Actually, before we do that, let's take a real quick look at 24. That's also really crucial. Moses gets the 70 elders, and he climbs up the mountain. He sacrifices, just as they had been told, young bulls as fellowship offerings, etc. Then in verse 6, Moses took half the blood and put it in bowls, and the other half he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people, and they responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said, we'll obey." And he took the blood, sprinkled on the people, and said, "This is the blood of the covenant the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up and saw the God of Israel. Verse 11, but God didn't raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites. They saw God, and with him they ate and drank. Whew. That is intimate family fellowship, and that is just a foretaste of what God wanted from the very beginning for his people. If only they would trust and obey. There's no other way but to trust and obey, as the old hymn goes. I have a book here entitled Covenant in the Old Testament, in which this whole chapter 24 is explained in terms of ancient family rituals by which family relationships are restored and strengthened through sacrifice and then a meal. Every tent was to be a tabernacle. Every hearth was to be an altar. Every father a priest. Every family, in a sense, a church. And the whole nation, a kingdom of priests. If only they would trust and obey and forsake the gods of Egypt, power, wealth, and pleasure. Exodus 32 tells us they didn't. Moses was up there fasting for 40 days. Can you imagine a 40-day fast? Hearing and receiving the word from God and the 10 Commandments and much else. And while they were waiting down in the valley, they tell Aaron, "Come make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." No longer did God do it. Moses did it. Aaron says, "Bring all your fine jewelry." They do. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf. The Apis cult of Egypt worshipped a calf, a golden calf. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to Yahweh." The next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry, which is a Hebrew cliche for a fertility cult behavior. It's a sexual orgy, just like the Egyptians after worshiping Apis. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down, because your people, whom you brought out of Egypt," you see what he's doing? He's disowning Israel. Don't underestimate the ferocious evil of the golden calf. It was an utter renunciation of true religion and faith to God. It was a total reattachment to the religion of Egypt. God said, "They're your people, Moses. Get down. You brought them out of Egypt. Leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them, and then I'll make you into a great nation." Moses could have said, "Hey, not bad. You destroy all those scoundrels, and you're going to start all over again with me, and the nation will be called Moses instead of Israel?" No. Moses says, "Blot me out instead. Remember the oath that you swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." All the world are going to look on, and they're going to say, "He could bring them out of Egypt, but he couldn't take Egypt out of them." Don't do it for your sake, not for them. And God relents. He knows how to fashion a mediator. He knows how to form a mediator's heart like Moses. And so the Lord relented in verse 14 and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened. Moses goes down, takes the tablets of stone, smashes them to pieces, takes the dust, throws it into the water, makes them drink, and then he calls out, "Who's on the Lord's side?" You'd think at this point the firstborn sons would say, "We are. After all, we're priests, and we would be dead in Egypt if it weren't for the Passover." They're conspicuously silent. Some scholars suggest that the golden calf was a symbol of the firstborn son. They might have been the perpetrators of the whole idolatrous act. But the Levites say to Moses, "We're on the Lord's side." He says, "Then take every man his sword and slay every man his kinsman." They took their swords, went to and fro throughout the gates of the camp, and slew 3,000 Israelite kinsmen. Moses doesn't say, "Guys, I only meant that figuratively, the sword of the Spirit." No. He says, well done, good and faithful servants. You today have ordained yourselves to be Israel's priests. Huh? What just happened? Well, we'll read in the next 2 or 3 books what happened. All 12 tribes were instantly and systematically defrocked and laicized, dispensed from the priesthood. And the tribe of Levi merited the priesthood. Why? In consequence of their burning with zeal for God's glory. Wimpy priests? No way. Effeminate priests? No way. Godly, manly, fatherly priests who burn with love for the children even when they're sinning and when they have to be punished. That's what the Levites stood for. Can you imagine, 1 week before the calf, you're worshiping and your father and your oldest brother's up there and then your uncle, and they're all leading the songs and the sacrifices. It's great. The next week you go to liturgy, your son is dead. He was slain by a Levite, and the murderer's up there leading the singing. And all the other guys up there slew your cousins and your nephews, 3,000 kinsmen. And the ones who did it are now the priests. God says, you take my commandments seriously. My law is a law of love. I love you too much to let you sin. And those who will burn with zeal for my law, I will raise up and empower. And do you know something? St. Thomas and many others have seen this. Maybe people today don't see it, but before the golden calf, all of the animal sacrifices and all of the dietary regulations seem not to have been required. They were discretionary votive offerings that you could make if you wanted and when you wanted after this initial sacrifice. It's only after the golden calf, it's only after the Levites become priests, it's only after the firstborn sons are all repudiated as God's priests that God imposes the books of Numbers and Leviticus upon the people so that every day they've got to be sacrificing, you got it, sheep, cattle, and goats. Why? It's like a woman who's been burned too many times by her alcoholic husband. 1 bottle of Jack Daniels smashed in the sink ain't enough. Every morning, Jack, when we wake up, you take your Jack Daniels and smash it in the sink. Every evening before you go to bed, you do the same thing. You ceremonially renounce every day of your life from now on that which has bound you. God says, I wanted to set you free from all of this earthly addiction, but you went back. Ezekiel 20:25 says, so God had to give them laws that weren't good. Animal sacrifice, hundreds of thousands and millions of goats and sheep and cow. Why? Because God loves blood and the smell of animal meat and flesh burning on the altar? No. Because they had to continually renounce the gods of Egypt and the gods of the various power religions and nature religions throughout the ancient Near East. And so Israel's religion became horribly complicated and bureaucratic. Bureaucratic because of the Levites. Now the families have been laicized. They're not priests anymore. They're bureaucratic and complicated because of all of the ceremonial sacrifices and all of the dietary regulations and so on. 2 laws now exist for Israel. Leviticus, which is the priestly code, which requires all kinds of purification and strict morality, and then Deuteronomy, which is given to the 12 tribes, which are now lay tribes, no longer priestly tribes. For the first time since creation, in Deuteronomy, God allows the 12 tribes, but not Levites, not the priests in Leviticus, but he allows the 12 tribes in Deuteronomy to divorce and remarry. Jesus said, Moses allowed divorce because of the hardness of your heart. He's talking about how God had to have 2 laws, one for those who took him seriously and one for those who wouldn't. In Deuteronomy, God has to allow divorce. The rabbi said because if he didn't, the Israelites would have killed their women to marry the ones they wanted. For the first time, we have harem warfare allowed. Genocide and extermination is allowed and permitted in Deuteronomy. Usury, charging interest on loans to other people, is allowed. All kinds of laws concerning slavery and polygamy and marrying slave women are allowed in Deuteronomy. The Levites had to follow the strictest marital morality because they were still priests. But the Deuteronomic law had all kinds of concessions and compromises. Scholars like Goldingay still see this. Wenham, that there were 2 laws now, as the vast majority of Israel was laicized. Was this what God wanted? No, of course not. This one scholar says, unfortunately for the people, they declined the privilege of being a national priesthood. in preference to representation under Moses and Aaron and the Levites. Therefore, the original purpose of God was delayed, but not scrapped or defeated forever. Delayed until New Testament times, when the priesthood of all believers was again proclaimed, 1 Peter 2:9, Revelation 1:6, and 5:10. Nevertheless, Israel's role of being the agents chosen by God to minister to the needs of the nations was not rescinded. In other words, from the golden calf until the coming of Christ, through their disobedience and through God's punishments, the nations would learn righteousness the hard way. Oh, that's what happens when we sin. Yeah. No longer would they be priestly teachers inspiring obedience. Now, through their disobedience and suffering of God's punishments, they teach the nations the ways of God. God's purpose was not thwarted. It was delayed. The Catholic Church teaches the priesthood of all believers. Baptism restores to Christians priesthood, a natural priesthood, making the family a domestic church, distinct from the sacramental and supernatural priesthood that we receive in holy orders. But don't let anybody ever trick you into believing that the Protestants believe in the priesthood of all believers, but not the Catholics. We believe in the priesthood of all believers through baptism, because at the age of 30, priests were anointed with water, and the word is baptizo. They were sprinkled. We are baptized, and thus we are restored in our families to the priesthood. Oh, I wish I could just get this across. I'd jump up and down in my head and spit dimes and nickels if I could do something to get this across to people today. Our families in the new covenant are what the families in Israel could no longer be. We can. We can be domestic churches. Fathers, religion is not a feminine enterprise. It's not women's work. It's not wimpy. To be religious is to be uncool, and to be cool is the rule. I've seen this in so many high school kids and college guys and so on. We've got to rediscover manly religion as well as womanly religion. We've got to see that it belongs in the home, at the table, with songs and with prayers, and with men of God acting out the part of priests and allowing the women to be prophets as well. Just as the Holy Father, Pope John Paul II, has insisted over and over again. Now, we could go on and on describing all of this, but I got to ask you one question, the same question I asked last night. What kind of God was Moses dealing with? I mean, to slay 3,000 kinsmen and then to merit the priesthood? To wipe out perhaps millions or at least thousands of firstborn sons and animals? To slay a lamb, to sprinkle the blood, and to make these people eat the lamb? What kind of God is that? And the same answer applies. The same God we have to deal with in Jesus Christ. Because Jesus Christ came as a new Moses. Remember how Moses was born and he was almost slaughtered? What happened to Jesus when he was born? He was almost slaughtered by a royal decree, wasn't he? And his parents had to flee. And where did he go for safety? Coincidentally, he went down into Egypt. And after the king died in this case, what happens? Matthew says, out of Egypt have I called forth my son, quoting Hosea's reflection on the Exodus. If Israel is God's firstborn son, how much more Jesus Christ? If Israel's enslaved in Egypt, so is Christ. If Israel is brought up out of Egypt, so is Christ. If Israel is brought through the waters, so is Christ, through the Jordan. If Israel had to go for 40 years in the wilderness and Moses fasted 40 days in the wilderness, what did Jesus do? Fasted for 40 days in the wilderness. If Moses had to go up the mount to give the law to the people to show what the Father wants, what does Jesus do? As soon as he's been out in the wilderness for 40 days being tempted by the devil, quoting the laws of Moses to rebuke the devil from Deuteronomy, just as the devil had tempted Israel out there for 40 years, Jesus goes up and preaches the Sermon on the Mountain, giving the new covenant law. And just as Moses took the 12 chiefs of the 12 tribes and then 70 elders to fashion a new church government, what does Jesus do? Takes 12 disciples and tells them, you'll sit on 12 thrones and rule the 12 tribes of Israel. And then Luke 10 tells us that he took 70 other disciples. What a coincidence, right? Wrong. He saw himself as the new Moses, given a new covenant to constitute a new Israel, and so did those people recognize it. In John 6, they said, "You're the prophet that Moses promised, the prophet like unto Moses." And what about the Passover? Christ is the firstborn son who is slain in Egypt, and he's also the lamb without blemish, without broken bones, that is slaughtered, whose blood is sprinkled, and whose body must be eaten. Suppose you didn't like lamb meat back then in Egypt. You killed the lamb, you sprinkled the blood, and you had lamb cookies instead, and you threw away the lamb. What would happen? You'd wake up, your firstborn son would be dead. You had to eat the lamb. Jesus Christ says in John 6, "Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him, and I will raise him up on the last day. My flesh is food indeed, my blood is drink indeed. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me." And all these Jews were horrified because Leviticus prohibited the drinking of blood. If you drink blood, you're going to have to be cut off from your family. And Jesus said, bingo, you got it right. If you drink my blood, you're going to be cut off from the family of Adam, and you're going to become attached to the family of the new Adam, the Son of God, the priest, the prophet, the king, the Messiah, the beginning and the end of it all, who has formed a new covenant and a new family in his own flesh and blood, which we celebrate every Mass. You got to eat the lamb. You don't just kill the lamb. A sacrifice requires a death, but the purpose of sacrifice is to restore family communion. And that is symbolized in eating the lamb in a family meal. And that, praise God, is what we do every Sunday. And for you fortunate and blessed daily communicants, every day. God be praised. He set this whole thing up. He loaded the dice. He stacked the deck. The whole of the Exodus, the whole entire Mosaic covenant was a curriculum in pre-Christian education. Isn't it about time we go back and learn the alphabet of our faith? Thank you very much.